That's good.
Why? I'm sure we should get a job.
Good morning. We're close to being on time, and that's where I'd like to keep it. Welcome to the 2017 Fall Forum of the State University Annuitants Association, UIC chapter. The title of today's forum is Our Pensions and the Budget. The fight is not over, and that the germ of that idea began at the SUAA annual meeting in June, when we were cautioned by SUAA's lawyers that just because we'd passed it, because the courts had ruled in our favor, didn't mean that the state would lay back and say, now, well, that's all over, that they would continue to deal with the budget and pension issues, trying to figure out how to reduce our pensions. So that's where we got the idea for this. SUAA, in case you don't know, is a statewide organization representing all current and retired public university staff and faculty, and is directed to preserving and protecting a strong pension system, healthcare benefits, and the general welfare of all faculty and staff throughout the public university system. I'm Bill Peterman. I'm the second vice president of the UIC chapter, which means that I'm responsible for legislative issues. I welcome all of you on behalf of the chapter. Especially I welcome our SUAA members who are out here, and I welcome those of you who are not SUAA members, but I think we're going to bar the door here until you leave today as a SUAA member. Obviously, we're not going to do that, but we would encourage you to join the other 15,000 to 16,000 people in the state of Illinois who are members of SUAA. About 10% of those are from the UIC chapter. The format for today's forum is that each panelist will make brief introductory presentation. Our moderator, Rachel Weber, then may choose to question or comment upon those presentations briefly. And then we will have questions from the floor. I have put 3x5 cards on your chair. Everybody should have one. You can fill out your question, and I'll be over here and looking. If you wave at me, I'll run and pick it up. We will have the questions first from the 3x5 cards, and then we'll obviously, hopefully, have time for questions from the floor. We have a traveling microphone over there. Please stay. As you came in, you would notice we have lunch set up. We were keeping you had been stabbed with a fork, even if it was a plastic fork, if you'd have grabbed a sandwich beforehand. But afterwards, you are certainly welcome and encouraged to eat and share discussion and comments and meet with the speaker and your fellow colleagues here from UIC. The moderator of our panel today is Rachel Weber. She is professor of urban planning and policy at UIC. She's been there since 1998. She is a neighbor and friend of mine. Rachel is not only a planner, but also a political economist and economic geographer. All of those are actually related. She has a very active research agenda. She studies the relationship between finance and the built environment, focusing on finance instruments such as tax increment financing and infrastructure such as school facilities. She has her PhD in 1998 from Cornell and has been at UIC since then, and is familiar with the work of both panelists. At this point, I will turn the meeting over to Rachel.
Thank you, Bill. We are very happy to be here. I'll speak for all three panelists, so thank you, Bill, for the invitation. And we are very lucky to have with us this afternoon two of the most distinguished public finance scholars, I think, in the country, and also very lucky for us They've been researching the state of Illinois and also working with state policymakers for decades. So I can really think of no two better people to help us understand a situation as complicated and as contentious as the state's pension crisis. So first, Dave Merriman is going to be speaking. Professor Merriman is the Stuckel Presidential Professor in the Department of Public Administration here at UIC, and also a professor in the Institute for Government and Public Affairs. He's been a visiting fellow at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Dave has been publishing research on a variety of topics in state and local public finance, from everything from very abstract and theoretical analyses of the forces that determine urban economic structures to very applied papers, like looking at the impact of Walmart on local retail markets. He's done work in Illinois on topics like tax increment financing, assessment caps, telecommunications tax rates, and state budget policies. And together, we're working on a project in IGPA that looks at the use of Illinois municipalities' uses of business tax incentives like abatements and TIF. And Professor Merriman co-founded and directs the University of Illinois' Fiscal Futures Project, which monitors the fiscal condition of the state of Illinois. And he has served on the State of Illinois' Council of Economic Advisors under both Governors Quinn and Rauner. We also have with us today Fred Giertz, who is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Economics, where he served as head from 2007 to 2010, and is also a member of the Institute for Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. He's been with the University of Illinois since 1980, so I think that makes you the most senior member up here. Professor Giertz specializes in state and local taxation and expenditure analysis and in regional economic development issues. From 2000 to 2014, he served as the executive director of the National Tax Association, which is a 1,200 member organization of tax professionals that is located in Washington, D.C. And he writes frequently on Illinois and compiles the U of I Flash Index, which is a monthly indicator of the Illinois economy. Very importantly for this panel, Professor Giertz was both appointed and then elected a member of the Board of Trustees for the State University's Retirement System, SURS, starting in 1995 and with a short absence will serve until 2021. I also believe we have another member of SURS board here, Steve Rock. Thank you for coming. Professor Giertz was the chair of the board's investment committee. So we're very happy to have both of these speakers here today. As Bill said, they will each speak for about 10 minutes, and then I will add some commentary or ask some questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you guys. So without further ado, Dave.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks very much, Rachel, for that very kind introduction. What I'm going to talk about actually is the broad state fiscal condition, which is what I know more about than the specifics, certainly the legal specifics of the pension situation. And I'm going to leave the task of talking much more about the specifics of SURS in particular to Fred. But I think that the context, the way I really think about it is the safety of the pension payments, the condition of the pension payments. It's partly a legal issue, partly a moral issue, and partly a political issue. And the political issue, it depends upon, well, there's a scarce resources, and how scarce are resources, and who's going to need those resources, and who best deserves those resources, is what is going to be in the political environment. And what I'm here to tell you is that resources are scarce at the state level. They're going to continue to be scarce. In fact, they're probably going to get scarcer. So it's not a good news story. And you have good reason, I think, to be anxious a bit. I don't know, I think retirees at least are in a relatively good position, but I think that there's going to be continuous pressure for at least a decade and probably longer for the state to have more austere policies with respect to all kinds of spending. So the evidence that I have for that is in a handout, a two-page handout or a two-sided handout that hopefully you had on your seats. And the first graph in that handout, there's a front and a back of it, but where it says pension reform in Illinois budget, so it's the front of it. The first graph shows what we've done with the Fiscal Futures Project to look at state revenues and expenditures and deficits. So this is a very broad measure of state of Illinois revenues, expenditures, and deficits. The top graph is expenditures, or the top line on the graph is expenditures. The line below it is revenues, and the bottom line is deficits. And just for your information, these are in billions of dollars. So, these are big numbers. State spending, you hear lots of different numbers about state spending, but when I usually think of it, I think of it as about $70 billion, okay? That's the kind of magnitude that you should be thinking about, and that's kind of all consolidated spending. We've gotten this data from the comptroller, so we're starting with a very, very large data set of expenditures and revenues, tens of thousands, and we kind of grind them down, crunch them down into manageable categories. And so this is our estimate of revenues, and I just caution you that you'll see other estimates that do these numbers in a different way. Ours are better. Okay, ours are better because we're thinking about them in a comprehensive and apolitical way, frankly, right? What's happened over time, so we have data going back now to 1998, and the most recent data is 2016, and the numbers start to get a little bit fuzzy when you come more recent data because all kinds of weird things have been going on, like a lot of unpaid bills, about $15 billion of unpaid bills. But the general trend you can see, the first trend you can see is that expenditures are very consistently higher than revenues. And you see a big bump in the mid-2000s of expenditures over revenues. What that was the Governor Blagojevich's pension bonds, pension obligation bonds, right? So they borrowed a bunch of money, and they put it into the pension fund. That's good for you guys. It reduced the liability level, but we had to pay off those bonds. And so we had expenditures far exceeding revenues in those years. And that we record that as a big deficit. You won't see that in most other time series. You also see big deficits during the Great Recession as well. And now you see growing deficits over the past few years. That was partly because of the phase out of the 5% income tax. At the same time the phase out of the 5% income tax happened, we also got cutbacks in federal grants. And so what you see is a situation that is frankly unsustainable, right? Despite the fact that we have a couple of clauses in the Constitution that says Illinois has to have what some people call a balanced budget. What the Constitution really says is that Illinois has to have, the governor has to propose a budget with resources available. But the resources can come from borrowing, resources can come from selling assets. And then the legislature is only supposed to make appropriations subject, again, to resources available. Well, even those kind of fig leaf budget balance requirements haven't, in our reckoning, been followed. So basically, we're running up more and more bills. We're using unsustainable revenue sources. We continue to do this. And, we're way out of whack, right? We're out of whack now on $60 billion or 60-some billion dollars of revenue, spending about $8 to $10 billion more each year than that, right? We can't continue to do that. And each year, we kind of do small things or temporary things to try and bring the budget more into balance, but we haven't dealt with the fundamental structural problem. The second graph is probably mislabeled. I'm afraid it's mislabeled. It says something about CSRS pension payments. It's actually all of the pension system, so I apologize for that. That was my mistake. I can't even blame it on anyone else. But you can see this shows current pension payments, which are now, I guess, about a total about $6 billion, or a little more than $6 billion. And the general trend is that those pension payments are going to go up over time. And this is what's scheduled under current law. And the truth is, it's not too bad. They aren't going up that fast, right? They're going to go up from about $6 or $7 billion to about $10 billion by 2025. That's a big chunk, but you're talking about a 60-some billion dollar or $70 billion of spending. It's not that large a percentage, but in the context, and I'm going to show you some other numbers of where we are in terms of the budget, that's going to be hard to sustain. And it's going to be painful for the legislature to do that, because not only do they have to continue spending as much as they are spending, they have to spend more, and they have to find the money somewhere. And there's really only two places to find the money. Either you do something to raise revenues, and that probably means taxes, or you cut some expenditures. You're going to see it's not easy to cut expenditures. So if you turn over to the other side of the page, what I've done here is I've showed just for 2016 what we calculate as expenditures that for the state's now $73 billion of spending we calculate in 2016. So first of all, $17 billion is Medicaid, right? It's a huge chunk of money. Why do we spend $17 billion on Medicaid? Well, healthcare is very expensive, as I'm sure you know. 1/5 of Illinois' population is eligible for Medicaid. And we've just done a big expansion, right? So we've put a lot of people that are relatively above the poverty line through Obamacare on Medicaid. There's all kinds of federal pressure to cut back on that, right? And so it's going to be difficult to sustain that Medicaid spending, but it's going to be difficult to cut it too, because those people really need it, right? We know that. That $17 billion isn't quite as bad as it looks, because the federal government's paying for a lot of it. And I'll explain that in a minute. The next big spending category, the next big spending category is K-12 education, right? Again, one of the only things in which there's bipartisan agreement on. The state of Illinois should spend more on education. Local governments, property taxes are too high. We want to lower government's property taxes. And the governor and legislature actually have agreed over the past few years to increase education spending. It's still not enough. There's still pressure to increase it. It's going to be very difficult to cut it. The third biggest item is pension spending, right? More than $7 billion. So if you're thinking it's going to be really hard to cut the first two, you're going to be looking at the third, right? It's really hard to cut that one too, but you can imagine there's going to be pressure on that. And then we go down, local government revenue sharing, right, is a big spending item. That's a portion of the income tax, that's a portion of the sales tax that's funneled out to local governments. Local governments are going to scream and cry when we try and cut that. There have been talk about cutting it. We probably could reallocate it. There are probably some things we could do about it, but that's not an easy sell politically by any means. And then we get down to smaller and smaller categories. Human services, again, is not fun to cut. Transportation, a lot of that is federal money, not easy to cut. Debt service, you just can't cut. Children and family services. So you're getting down to kind of places where it's really, really hard to think of any spending to cut. Okay. Now look over, please, and I give you the share of each category. Now please look over to the third category, the third column there, compound annual growth rate of spending. So this is the historical growth rate. Right? The historical growth rate of spending of these categories, the big one has been state pension contributions, right? And that actually has nothing to do with the services delivered or the number of employees. That state pension growth is just because the state fell way behind on pension payments and put in a ramp and decided legislatively to increase spending, but it's still a shock to legislators. We didn't used to have this much spending on pension. How come we're spending so much on pension? They don't like it. And obviously that 17.7% is not going to continue under current law, at least what's scheduled, and this is the only one where I have scheduled payments. It's going to go up at 3.3% a year over the next decade or so. right? That's what the law says now. So that's easier to take than 17.7%, but it's an increase every year, right? That's the average. K-12 education has increased much slower, only 1.2%. Medicaid's increased fast, 4.3%. And unless somebody somewhere figures out how to reduce the growth of healthcare costs, it's probably going to continue to increase, right? It's really hard to think about us getting that down too much. Now, there's all kinds of people with all kinds of different ideas about how we're going to cut that back, but we haven't had much success so far, right? And then you can look down the other categories. The total, if you look at the total at the bottom, spending on average is growing 3.4% per year. That's over the last decade. That's what it's grown at. Okay, look at the bottom now, the last table here. This is revenues. Okay, there's basically only 3 revenue sources that you really have to think about. Income tax, sales tax, federal aid. Right? You all know the story with the income tax, right? We had to work real hard to get it back up to 5%. 5% is not that high. I think it's unlikely we're going to be able to do much to increase the income tax rate, at least across the board, regardless of who we elect. If we want to graduate an income tax rate, there's a lot of constitutional hurdles to that. It'll take a while. Possible. That could change things. Income tax revenue has been growing at 3.7%. There's a bunch of policy changes involved in there, but income tax revenue will grow at least under the flat rate income tax that we have now, roughly as fast as economic growth grows. It's not going to grow a lot faster than that. The sales tax is still a big revenue source, but it's growing more slowly, and it's probably going to continue to grow more slowly, and that's because the things we tax are a relatively, limited sector of the economy, and not the things that are growing fastest. It's not the things we spend on most. And so the sales tax is growing much slower than the economy as a whole. Okay, then the third category, which is a very big category of revenue, the third and fourth categories together are federal revenue. Those are big, very important revenue sources. So you see, we've got about 11 billion of that 17 billion we spend on Medicaid comes from the federal government. Well, that's good news. So Medicaid really isn't costing us as much as we think, right? But, there's a lot of pressure. The federal government wants to block grant Medicaid. The federal government wants to cut back on Medicaid. Federal governments, if you think Illinois' fiscal disjuncture, fiscal mismatch is bad, the federal government's much worse, right? The federal government has much higher spending, much bigger deficits as a share of the economy than Illinois does. So the federal government's doing everything it can to cut back on spending, and it's going to be hard to sustain federal grants either on Medicaid, which are particularly politically contentious, or the rest of those federal grants are also going to have pressure, except possibly infrastructure. Possibly we could have more transportation spending from the federal government, but I think it's a pretty bleak picture. So for our 3 big revenue sources, it's very hard to see rapid increases. Can look at other smaller revenue sources. There's some small possibilities of raising some revenues in one place or another, but it's going to be difficult. Bottom line, look at the growth rate over the past 10 years in revenues, all the way at the bottom of that table on the right, 2.6%. Revenues are growing slower than expenditures. What has to happen is those two things have to align. What's likely to happen to get those two things aligned is slower growth of expenditures and some kind of way in which we can have more rapid growth of revenues. There's a number of policy alternatives we can talk about in the question of how we might increase the rate of growth of revenues. But just increasing the income tax rate or just increasing the sales tax rate, that won't change the growth rate of revenues. It'll change the amount, but not the growth rate. So it's going to be a temporary solution. So that's why I expect continued pressure for a long time until we get these growth rates aligned with each other. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I always enjoy talking about these issues, even though the substance may not be as enjoyable. Let me start with a couple disclaimers. The first thing is that although I'm a SURS board member, I'm not speaking officially for SURS, so these are my own opinions, impressions, things of that sort. The second thing, we're not going to do a lot of this, but it's like a financial advisor. I would not take any individual action based upon what I say here without checking with SURS consultants, things of that sort. So this is not supposed to be a consulting session about whether or not you should retire or whatever. So with that, those caveats, let me go forward. I use the same. I apologize for saying the same thing. I probably said 4 or 5, 6 different meetings, but there's a quotation from the Simpsons, and Homer Simpson has a toast. He says, "To alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems." And the state of Illinois has come to believe that pensions are the cause of all our problems, and they're also the solution to all our problems by figuring out a way to deal with them. Well, as David has shown, and David and Dick Dye, that's really not the case. The pensions are a manifestation of the problem, and they're a part of the problem, but they're not the problem by itself. And the reason for that is that over a long period of time, the state chose to not fully fund the pension programs. And you go back 20, 30 years, the legislature meet, they have a lot of things they'd like to do, all these programs they'd like to approve. They don't want to increase taxes, they don't have enough to pay for all of their activities, so one way of, in quotes, financing that is to underfund the pensions that particular year. So in 1980 or 82 or something, underfunding the pensions by $100 billion didn't seem to be a big deal. Well, two things have happened. One has happened continually over quite a long period of time, and the second thing is that those underfundings were not available to generate a return. So to make up for $100 billion of underfunding back 30-some years ago, you'd have to have $1 billion today to do that. So we not only lost the contributions, we lost the return on those contributions. So the state basically was financing its activities by underfunding the pensions, and that's led to the situation where we have a huge underfunding problem right now. I compare that to the alternative. What would have happened back in those days, and this is not just Blagojevich or just anyone, it's Thompson, Edgar, Bryan, Blagojevich, all the way along. So we're not blaming one person. It was sort of a practice on the part of the General Assembly and the governor. But there was an alternative then. They could have, instead of not putting the $100 billion into the pension fund, they could have sold bonds, and there'd be $100 million of bonds that they owe, and put the $100 billion into the pension fund. Now, if they had done that over a long period of time, what would the problem be? Well, it wouldn't be pension underfunding, it would be bond repayment. So they basically have chosen an implicit way of borrowing money. Instead of borrowing it explicitly from the financial sector, they borrowed it implicitly from the pensions. And so again, it's something that happened. So I don't think that you can say, well, the pensions caused this. There haven't been huge pension benefit increases over the years. Rates of return, they're up and down, but they basically met expectations. There have been some expansions, things of that sort, but generally, if you have to isolate why are we underfunded today, the answer would be largely lack of timely contributions. All right, so that's kind of the starting point. Now let me talk about the current situation a little bit more. And again, like Rachel said, I do research. I think I more consume research now than I do research, but I go back to a study that David and Dick Dye did several years ago, and the study was, we have this we have the structural deficit, which is pretty large, and the state was saying, well, we could solve this by pension reform and so on. And two things happened. And they said, what would happen if we had pension reform? What would happen if we had a continuation of the 5% income tax rate as opposed to allowing it to expire? And the answer was still a growing deficit. And what happened? Well, we didn't get the pension proposal approved. It was shot down by the Supreme Court, and we let the tax increase expire. So we went